Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Welcome back, listeners. Today we're going to talk about a topic we've covered a few times, which is that intersection of wildlife and energy development here in Wyoming, and the implications, of course, are more broad than Wyoming, but we have some really great models that have been developed here in the state in how to balance energy production and wildlife management. And so we're going to hear today on this very topic, we're going to focus on sage-grouse. So today I am honored to have Mr. Bob Budd. He is Executive Director of the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust. So welcome, Bob.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Thanks so much for being here. Can you start by telling our listeners about your background, how you came to work at the trust and your role there?
Sure. I'm a fifth-generation Wyomingite. My great-great-grandfather settled the town of Big Piney in 1879 or thereabouts, and so grew up in an agricultural background. My mother's family was from Dubois and ranched up there. Went to the University of Wyoming, got degrees in animal science and ag business, and then came back later and got my master's in range management. I worked 15 years for the Stock Growers Association after I got out of school. Left there to go manage a ranch in Fremont County outside of Lander. Was there for 12 years, and then they created the Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust, and it was probably about as an ideal a position as I'd ever seen, and so I applied and was selected to be the director. It blended all the things I believed in, was that the compatible development, the fact that if we don't have ranching, we don't have wildlife, and how do you help people make habitat better and at the same time make that habitat better for their cattle or their sheep or whatever they're doing. It was just kind of a synchronicity or whatever you want to call it, but a serendipitous moment. It was a perfect job for what I believe in and what I do, and I've been blessed to have fantastic boards for the last 20 years, and then you get tapped for other duties as assigned, and that's how the sage-grouse thing came about.
And so you were chairman for Wyoming Sage-Grouse Implementation Team, which we're going to call SGIT. Mm-hmm. Since being appointed to that role, you've been chairman since 2007.
Correct.
And it was Governor Friedenthal that appointed you.
Yes.
So talk about your role as chairman of that group.
Well, the group, there's actually a pretty good story, and Governor Friedenthal likes to tell it too, that we had a big summit in Casper to talk about the future of sage-grouse in Wyoming. It had been petitioned for listing numerous times. He said, we aren't going to go through this all the time. We need to figure out what to do. And he asked Ryan Lentz, who was on his staff at the time, to help. And as I say, he just put his hands around my neck and said, you're going to do this. And so we came back and said, we think we ought to create a group that includes oil and gas, mining, ranching, conservation groups, county government, all the agencies that have skin in the game or have their oar in the water, and have them help sort out what the solution is. And as I recall, he said, you two are nuts, but it might work. If it does, I'll take credit, and if it doesn't, you're both fired. But we did put that group together. So we had a group of about 26 people to start out, and it included the Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Game and Fish, DEQ, all the agencies that had an interest in sage-grouse conservation. And then we had 2 ranchers, 2 oil and gas people, 2 miners, county government. The tribes were offered a position. They said they were covered by Fish and Wildlife. We had wind energy and transmission. So it was a very broad, diverse group. And that group sat down, and my role was to coordinate those meetings. We sat down and I said, we need a goal. And they very quickly led on a 2-part goal. One was to maintain our economy in Wyoming, and the other was to preclude the need for the bird ever to be listed as endangered. And that's very subtle, but it's very important distinction. The goal was not to prevent a listing. The goal was to preclude the need to ever have one.
Okay.
So if you look at the rider in Congress, that prevents a listing. The work we've done on the ground here that maintain habitat and keep the bird in healthy populations and cycling the way it should, that precludes the need for a listing.
Gotcha. So it's not about just preventing the listing, using whatever means possible. It's actually actually addressing the issue.
Yeah, perpetuating the species and making sure that they'll be here long after we're gone.
So you had that whole group in 2007 when this SGIT was stood up, and is it still kind of the same structure today?
It is still the same structure with the exception that we've added a couple. We added a mineral owner. We're proposing that happen, and we added a weed and pest representative recently.
And how do individuals get to be in that group?
The ones from the agencies are designated in the statute that creates it, so it's whoever they send. The governor appoints the others. The citizen members are appointed by the governor.
Great. That's very much like our Energy Resources Council and other governance boards around the state. Great. So I think you define this when you're saying listing, you mean Endangered Species Act. So listing the sage-grouse as an endangered species. If that were to happen, what would that mean for the state, particularly for us here at the School of Energy Resources? We're interested in energy. You can talk more broadly too, but
sure.
What would that mean?
Well, if you look at the historic range of sage-grouse in Wyoming, it's about 75 to 80% of the state is within that, is mapped as that. And the pieces that aren't are the far southeast corner and the Wind Rivers, the Bighorns, the mountainous regions. So everything else, all the basin and range, all of the high plains, all of the mixed grass prairie, those are all historic sage-grouse range. Our strategy, we identified the areas where the sage-grouse are really strong, where they have the best habitat, where their populations are the most robust, and created what we called core areas. That's about 25% of the surface of the state is in core areas.
Wow.
But if you list it, it's all the birds and all of the habitat that potentially could be occupied by them. So it takes you from 25% of the land mass to about 80% of the land mass. If there's a federal nexus, it requires a permit. It requires consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And that nexus could be that you have to go across a 40 of federal land to get to the place where you want to drill a well. The nexus is really big when you look at the Powder River Basin, where a big percentage of that is a subsurface is owned by the federal government. So it would affect that much more. And the regulations would be whatever the feds did. We would no longer have jurisdiction over the species, which now we do, and we do a great job of managing it.
That's exactly what I was just thinking. So what we're trying to do here, what Wyoming is trying to do, is really be proactive, because if there were to be a listing under the Endangered Species Act, then we've really lost the control to be proactive. We can't. It's no longer within our purview, right? It becomes a federal issue in a lot of ways.
Exactly. And if you look at all of the trials and tribulations that we've dealt with grizzly bears as an example, obviously on a much smaller geographic scale, or with wolves and some of those, once the federal government takes over management, it becomes very problematic, because in some ways it becomes an unfunded mandate to the state to do things, but they have to do it within the parameters that are set out by the feds. It's difficult. It's divisive. It doesn't allow us to do creative solutions. It doesn't allow us to do what we do now with sage-grouse, which is avoid first, minimize impact second, and if need be, look at compensatory mitigation. And industry has been phenomenal in meeting the first bar, the avoid. Figure out a way not to have a problem.
And is it fair? I mean, it would be catastrophic to our energy sector if there was a sage-grouse listing. And it's kind of all of the above energy sector too, right?
It's more than even just the energy sector. I mean, if you think about bentonite as an example, it's not an energy mineral. It's essential to the energy industry, but sand and gravel, every bit of that would be affected. And yes, it could be catastrophic. At the minimum, it's going to be difficult. It certainly would drive people to the Permian. It certainly would drive people to the Bakken. It'd certainly drive them to Pennsylvania if you're looking at oil and gas. So yes, it could have absolutely catastrophic economic effects on our state. You think about jobs, you think about all the people that work in the energy sector. A listing would be devastating.
Yeah. So let's talk about the process then that has been used, this collaborative process where you're bringing in all these stakeholders. So the first Wyoming sage-grouse core area map, it was developed in 2008. And later that year, the first Wyoming sage-grouse executive order was signed. So how did the map and the executive order dictate how and where? And again, we're focused on energy, and let's bring in minerals, energy and minerals. How do those impact how energy and minerals are developed in the state?
So the way we did it, we gave a number of recommendations to Governor Friedenthal and said, these are the things we think will achieve the end result we're after, which is conservation of sage-grouse and maintenance of our economic system. That then became the executive order, which came from the governor to the agencies of the state. And the agencies of the state then follow that executive order. So there's a process in there. If I come in and I propose I want to drill a well or I want to put in a gravel pit, if it's within a core area, then you go through a process where you evaluate what the impacts that are already there are, if it is going to add to that. And all of this is based on the science and updated constantly on the science, the best science that's available. So what we found is that at 5% disturbance and just one activity per square mile, the birds are pretty much not fazed by that. You start to get above that and the birds start to show avoidance. You start to see possibly population changes. You see things habitat that doesn't get used.
So they're changing their behavior.
They do change their behavior, yes. So we said, all right, if you're going to be above that, how do we keep you below that, number one? And the avoidance strategies that people have used include co-location, development. If I can move my well out of good sagebrush habitat and move it a quarter mile or whatever it is into an area that's already been disturbed, then I'm not going to have the same amount of impact. And that's dictated then when they draw a permit from the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission or from Department of Environmental Quality. That gets reviewed by the Game and Fish. What's called a density and disturbance calculation tool is used to see what the impact will be. And the permit may be conditioned on that. It may be denied, and it may just be permitted because people have thought through it. And what we found early on was that people would just submit the permit, and we finally had several meetings with industry and said, guys, it makes a lot more sense if you come in and say, here's what I need to do, and then let the biologists, let the rest of us help you figure out how to do that in the least obtrusive manner. And industry bailed into that and has done a phenomenal job.
They just work with you up front.
Before the permit is even filed, so that when it does get filed, you know what you're reviewing and they know what they have a better idea what the outcome will be.
So that collaborative process and then just the SGIT in general, do you think that approach would work in other states? I know other states have looked to Wyoming and to you specifically for guidance. What are your thoughts on Wyoming being a leader and whether or not it's possible for other states to follow what's happened here?
Other states have followed it. I worked with the state of Utah, the state of Nevada. I went to Idaho, Montana, and walked them through our process. They've all, because we are parochial, everybody has to have their own stamp on it, which is fine. Yeah. We're the same way.
Right.
And they all had a little different twist. Idaho's issues are very different than Wyoming's issues. They don't have an energy sector to speak of, but they have a huge risk from fire and cheatgrass. So their strategy is different than ours, but essentially I think all the states have taken a similar approach, which is where are the birds doing the best? Where's the best habitat? And how do we protect that and grow it? And what's been called protect the core, grow the core. That's the strategy that I think almost every state has adopted. Not all of them have done it using a SIGT type process. Nevada does. They have a sagebrush council that they set up when I was working with them, and it's still very active. Utah did that to get their plan put together. I don't know how active it is. Montana has one, and Idaho has one. So everybody uses the similar process. It has to be tailored to how their state works.
I like that. Wyoming's in front and developed this collaborative approach to this issue. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to use your words, preclude or avoid the need for a listing, it has to be bigger than one state, doesn't it?
It does. And, that's the way that the listing petitions have been done. They've been done in numerous ways. They've tried to petition to list the population in Washington state as a subset, or basically a separate population. That was denied. The bi-state population between California and Nevada, that one was granted, and that's managed as an endangered species. But the petitions are range wide. So there are 11 western states that are affected by that. And then you have two very different ecosystems. You have the Great Basin and the Rocky Mountains. And the Great Basin has different threats than the Rocky Mountains. How you address threats is a key part of whether or not a listing comes down. And so I was served on another group that basically was the threats analysis team. And that one looked at what are the potential threats out there and what are you doing to ameliorate or eliminate those threats. And so and examples of those are energy development. Then that would be unrestricted energy development could result in a loss of habitat and an exceedance of that 5%. Improper grazing, wild horses. There are numerous potential threats, and all of those need to be addressed somewhere in your plan.
And so Wyoming's state-specific approach, it's as set out in the sage-grouse executive order, it's really been continued through different Wyoming administrations, so Democrat and Republican governors, and revisions have been made, but it's been pretty consistent for the last 15 years. But then the Bureau of Land Management, the federal BLM, released its latest revision of the sage-grouse resource management plan about a month ago. So how closely does that RMP mirror the state's executive order?
Not as closely as it should, unfortunately. And I think what you started with is actually fairly compelling. We started this process when George Bush was president. Mm-hmm. And we've worked right through the Obama administration, through the Trump administration, the Biden administration. We've gone through 3 governors, 1 Democrat, 2 Republicans, and other states have done the same thing. The current draft, our resource management plan, there are 3 or 4 areas where we are not close to each other. It's been a different process. The way we did it to start out back in 15 when they did their first plan was very organic. It was ground up. The SIGT was very involved. And we worked with the federal agencies to build it from the ground up for Wyoming and then build that into a regional look. The 19 amendments were done the same way. This one was very top-down. This one came out of D.C. as their product, and we were supposed to acclimate to that. Well, we have laws, we have executive orders, we have standard operating procedures in Wyoming that need to be reflected in that, and they aren't all there.
How does it work if something that comes down from the feds is in conflict with state laws or executive orders or this working group? What's the resolution approach?
Ideally, we would sit down and sort that out.
Given you said this is kind of the first time this has happened.
It is the first time. And so we've tried to sit down and sort that out. As an example, Wyoming has a law that we cannot share data that would be harmful to the state. And the new plan from the feds came in and said the states will give data. Well, they can't direct us to give data. And as we pointed out, it's illegal. It violates the law for us to do that. Now, can we analyze the data and give you a picture? Absolutely, and that's what we've offered to do. But it's been a pretty disappointing top-down, heavy-handed approach this time, and that doesn't work. We've proven that. That's how we've done things when I started my career. It was beat up the other guy when you get the chance and then take your beating when you don't. That doesn't work. And that's the beauty of the SIGT and the beauty of what we've done with migration, the beauty of what we've done with a lot of things in this state is we find solutions. And are they perfect? No, they're not perfect for industry. They're not perfect for wildlife all the time. But do they work? Yeah, they do.
That's really well said. And I love you're calling it SIGT.
Yeah, that's what everybody calls it.
Okay. So that's still the sage-grouse implementation.
SGIT.
Yeah, okay.
It's just shortened. We got to figure out a way to have an acronym for everything, don't we?
Yes. SIGT. It's great. Rolls off the tongue. Okay. Just want to make sure I'm being accurate. So, Okay, perfect. So in terms of going back to the BLM plan or the sage-grouse resource management plan, what are some of the key differences that would have an impact on energy development, and how can the state try to address those?
So one of the big ones is adaptive management, and it's a adaptive management by just put the 2 words together. It means you adapt when something comes up. One of the problems is that there are people out there that want adaptive management to be prescriptive. In other words, if something happens, I've already preordained what the response is going to be. Well, that's easy enough if let's say it was a West Nile outbreak. what are you going to do? You're going to go in and you're going to treat mosquitoes. You're going to have, okay, fine. But most of the time when we see an anomaly in populations or where we have a major fire like we've had this last year, there are multiple factors that are going to contribute to potential threats. Not one. So you can't just go in and deauthorize grazing permits. You can't go in and say, no, you can't lease minerals here. That doesn't necessarily address the need for the species. So we want that to be proactive. We want it to be in process where people sit down in a collaborative manner and say, what do we need? What is the best thing we can do to address the house draw fire as it relates to sage-grouse? And already we're working on that as the state. Does that mean that we look at potential seeding of sagebrush? We haven't done that post-fire. We don't know exactly. Are there going to be areas where we have to be more aggressive in restoration than what we normally would be? Have we even identified the areas that are going to come back even better than they were because fire isn't all bad? Mm-hmm. No, we haven't got all that. So how do you write a prescriptive response to that, put it in a federal plan that's supposed to have a life of 10 to 20 years, and have it be right? It's wrong the minute the ink dries.
So one of the things we hear over and over from energy developers, and probably all developers, but we're focused on energy, is the importance of regulatory certainty.
Right.
Especially when you're developing projects or assets, I mean, truly can go decades. So how is this federal sage-grouse RMP, what do you see as the impact to regulatory certainty that the state has attempted to provide energy developers through its executive order?
Potentially, you could end up dealing with two completely different permitting systems. We have a dual permitting system in Wyoming, and we have had very good success with the cooperation and crosstalk between us, between federal and state, as to how to address that. So right now, if I'm a company and I know what the rules are, I know that I've got a 5% cap on disturbance. I know I've got a 1 per 640 activity cap. I know that first thing I need to do is avoid. The next is to minimize, and ultimately then I can look at compensatory mitigation. Those are all knowns. We know the tool, the DDCT, the density and disturbance calculation tool, that we know what that is. They know what that is. So they can have their consultants or their staff go in, analyze that ahead of time. They can sit down and collaborate with the wildlife agencies and say, where is the best place to locate this well? Where is the best place to access this gravel pit? What can we do? And that's happening. If you go to another system, then they go through all that process with the state, and there's a federal nexus, and they go in and the feds say, no, we're not issuing permits. That's devastating.
Yeah.
And that takes all that certainty away, which now it's pretty certain. I mean, there can be glitches in that, and we have to go back and sort those out. But for the main part, what we have is a fairly elegant system that people have been able to accommodate to and say, yeah, I'm not going to disturb that site because I know it's important. Maybe I'll drill horizontally. Maybe I'll go directional. Maybe I'll go some other technique. And that's been very successful. And of course, the technology has improved immensely in the last 10 to 15 years. So we can do a lot of the development we need to do without having any impact at all.
It's a great point. We had director Bruce from Game and Fish on the podcast earlier, and she was talking about other approaches, even just changing when you're going to have activities, just having that collaborative development to say, oh, maybe this isn't the right time to do drilling, but to adjust the schedule a little bit, and then you've made that accommodation.
Right.
Yeah.
That's one. And we've seen a lot. I mean, I remember one that I worked on. And you're an engineer, so you understand this. If you go to an engineer and say, I would like to put a well pad here, the engineer is going to find you the straightest line to get to that well pad. And any curves, engineers don't like curves.
No, we don't like curves.
They like straight things. Mm-hmm. Biologists really like curves.
Yeah.
So we had one where we looked at it, and at that time I said, could you put that road over here so that it's behind the hill and it won't affect the birds on that lack? Well, could we? Yes. Okay, then you don't have any impact. Or you can run your straight line through and pay mitigation in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, or add a little bit of cost to your road. And that's the kind of solutions that we look for. And they're good. They work.
I feel like I should stand up for engineers here, but I totally agree with what you said.
You don't have a chance.
Oh, man. Okay, well, then we better move on. So we haven't talked much about your work. We've been mostly focused on sage-grouse, and the reason is because a few reasons. It's so important to the state to prevent the need for a listing for our energy sector. And also it's just a really great model that's been developed, right. This collaborative model. And I think it's not limited to sage-grouse, but really is really very well done. So thank you for your leadership on that over the years. But let's loop back to your work at the Trust. So again, the Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust. Can you talk about how it contributes to the sage-grouse habitat improvement in the state and how that is a valuable component to successfully managing the bird?
Sure. We're always looking, if you look at, the way I put it is you have a ledger and you've got assets and you've got liabilities. And assets are all those places that we can go in and restore habitat, where we can do things, restore it, make it better, remove threats. As an example, conifers growing in sagebrush become a roost point for raptors, and sage-grouse avoid that habitat, even though it's ideal for nesting or for early brood rearing. Riparian areas, little mesic areas that they use in the late part of the year, we actually have put literally millions of acres back into play for that species by doing habitat restoration, habitat treatments. And sometimes they're treating sagebrush, sometimes they're adding water we had one that was really good over in Sublette County where they had a stock well, and we asked them to put in overflows to where they created little wetlands below it.
Oh.
I went up and looked at that project in the fall after it was done, and sage-grouse feathers were everywhere. They'd come in there and molted in that. And so you see the success, but we rebuild rivers, we build wetlands, we do sage-grouse habitat, we do mule deer habitat. All of those things are part of what the Trust does every year.
And I think, am I correct in understanding you're adding habitat and addressing habitat around the state, but I think you said that net, you're ahead.
We're way ahead.
You've
in
net
Wyoming.
added, not just added, but net added.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, you've got industry out there following the avoid, minimize, and mitigate strategy. You've got the other side of the coin, the conservation side, which is aggressively going out and saying, hey, we need to do these things to improve this habitat. We're adding on the scale of millions of dollars to the asset side relative to tens of thousands maybe on the debit side.
Got it.
And so that's important for us to be able to show, yeah, we are committed to this species, to that and the other 70 some odd or 80 other species that are sagebrush obligates. There are a lot of other species that benefit from the work we do with sage-grouse. And so that's how we do things in Wyoming. It's not at the exclusion of everything else. Figuring out how to make this work and maintain the things that are important to all of us. This is an outdoor state. People don't live here. If they don't like the outdoors, they leave pretty quick.
Yeah. So, okay, that's really well said. And obviously, I think it's important to realize that this really has been a really successful collaborative effort. Now, you have a leadership role now. This is something we all like to talk about a lot on our podcast, is leadership as well. So it's like leadership and energy and whatever else is interesting at the moment. And part of leadership, and especially what you've had to deal with, you've had to lead groups that maybe have common interests but don't report to you, right? So through the SIGT. So can you talk about your approach to leadership and your leadership style and anything you've learned over the years?
Oh, Lord.
That's a big question.
I've learned a lot.
Yeah.
And I actually do a presentation a lot of the time to students, particularly about how it was when I started my career. Everything was done in battle.
Yeah,
everything was done in battle. You went in and you fought your fight. And I remember winning a big fight in the legislature at one point, and a legislator who was the swing vote on a committee, I prevailed by one vote, came out, and I was very happy, and he was scowling, and he looked at me and he said, I wish someone would come in here and be able to talk about the ecology and the economy in the same breath, instead of you talking about economics and them talking about ecology and leaving us confused. And that's when I went back to school and got my master's in ecology. And I think that the things I've learned, number one, is our most important communication tool is our ears. If we'll close our mouth and listen and figure out where people are coming from. We learned that on the SIGT. It was really critical at one point because we had gone and done tremendous things. I mean, found common ground, and all of a sudden we hit a brick wall. And I had one meeting, I was really pretty dejected. The next one was worse. And I finally thought, we've spent all this time educating everybody about how sage-grouse live, how they eat, how many chicks they have, how soon the chicks are on their own. Every bit of sage-grouse natural history we'd done. We'd never done oil and gas 101. And people had no clue what the steps were going from exploration to a lease to ultimately production to having fuel to put in your gas tank. So we did oil and gas 101. Then we did mining 101, and we did that with both leasables and locatables. And we did grazing 101. And so that everybody was constantly being brought up to the same level of understanding. The other thing that I've learned is that, and at one time I was really a strong believer in collaborative process meant that you had consensus. I've used as chairman an 80-20 rule.
Yeah.
When 80% of the people in the room are all nodding their head, we're going to move on. Now, you always have to temper that with if those 80% are everybody but one particular sector. If that's everybody but the conservation groups, you're not ready to move on. You've got to find a better result than where you're at. Likewise, if everybody except the oil and gas industry is on board. But what I found is people are looking for a way to find commonality. And you have to have patience. Slow is fast. That's another thing that I would say. You can go in and try and hammer out a resolution in 2 days, lock people in a room. It isn't going to work. You need time for them to understand each other, to do oil and gas 101 and sage-grouse 101. But I think those are key things. The other things that have been really important to us, good science. Sound science that you can actually see and understand. And it's not a lot of times bench scale. It's stuff that's been done. What do we know if we get out into a landscape and do something landscape scale as opposed to just modeling it or playing with the bench scale analysis? That's really important. And when I say science, it's interesting because you talk to a group and say we use good science. None of them think about good science being downhole technology. They don't think about good science being timing of when during the day or during the year that you actually have activity. That's all good science too. It's not just biology. Mm-hmm. There's chemistry, there's physics, there's all of those things. And good science in all of those adds up to where you end up with good solutions.
That's really well said. Okay, can you say that one more time? Your best communication devices.
Your most important communication device is your ears.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's so good.
I don't remember where I got that. I heard that years ago and it just resonated. It was like, boy, that's really true. And it, in fun, I've told the story about we carry preconceived notions with us. And so if I preconceive that you as an engineer are not going to care about something I care about, then I'm hesitant to throw it out to you. But what I've found is that the commonality in groups like these, like the SIGT and others, the commonality is probably, again, 80-20 or 90-10. And when we find what we have in common, it's much easier to address the things that we don't have in common. And I think that's where that listening ability and understanding what people are saying is important, but it's just as important to understand each other's values because they're often very, very similar.
I really agree. And I think even that 20%, often if they've felt heard and they know you understand where they're coming from, they may not agree, but they're going to be still completely engaged and supportive with the process because they know that they're being heard. And the next one, whatever their concerns were, might win the day. So I think that's really big.
Yes. Or even I've seen this happen numerous times. You'll be 3 meetings down the road because when we did the SIGT, we met about every 3 weeks, nonstop until we got the recommendations to the governor. We did that when we did the planning in 2015. But what will happen is that somebody will have an epiphany driving down the road a month, 2 months later and say, hey, can we go back to that? I have an idea. And you'll see it just gel and people grin and say, yes, let's do that. So you have to have a dynamic ability to, write a plan or a law and set it in stone. those usually don't work. That's the beauty of the way that we've done this with the SIGT is that it's dynamic, and you can go back and say, let's readdress this. Maybe what we learned a decade later tells us that we didn't have it right the first time.
Didn't ask the right questions, maybe, or something.
Or maybe technology changed. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think you can imagine that's even more true when you're talking about research here at the School of Energy Resources or education. Yeah, always checking to make sure we're still on the right road and nothing new's come to light. So I appreciate that. I love that perspective on leadership, and you have a lot of experience at it. So these have all been softballs, but for your last question, I'm going to have to give you a hardball. And I think it's a hardball because you certainly in this work must have been, and fifth generation Wyomingite, been everywhere in the state. So what's your favorite place to go in Wyoming? If you could be one place, where would it be?
There's no possible way for me to answer that. I mean, Big Piney and Sublette County is always home to me. That just growing up there as a kid, but if in the book I wrote, Otter's Dance is all about Wyoming and places and experiences, and it runs the gamut. I mean, I've had experiences in the Powder River Basin that were magical, life-altering. Yeah. Same thing. I tend to gravitate toward sagebrush and grass. That makes sense. One of my friends one time, we were derailing about how much we were mad at tree huggers, and she looked at her husband and I and said, "You two are just grass huggers. You're no different." and she was right, and we went, "Okay, you're right." So, but yeah, I like the open spaces. As an aside to that, the first job I was offered out of undergraduate school, I went, and it was a good job. It was a banking job in Iowa. And I was so proud and called my parents and said, "Yeah, I got the job." And I got up the next morning and called them and said, "I can't do this." And they said, "Why?" And I said, "There's too many trees. I can't see." It really was claustrophobic. Yeah. But there's no one place. This is a wonderful state, and every inch of it is special, from the short grass prairie to the mixed grass prairie, to the mountains, to the sagebrush steppe. It's just a phenomenal place. Thank you so much for all you do for the state. You bet. Thank you for being here on this podcast. Yeah, enjoyed it very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.